So, President Joe Biden has told his fellow Democrats that it's time to put up or shut up, daring those who want to replace him as the party's nominee in the race for the White House to challenge him at next month's convention. He's written to Democrats in Congress saying it's time for questions over his candidacy to end. He stressed that the party has one job: to defeat his Republican rival Donald Trump in November. The 81-year-old president has come under growing pressure since his disastrous performance in a debate with Donald Trump. A primetime interview on Friday did little to reassure his party, but he delivered a defiant message in a phone interview with MSNBC earlier today.
We're not going anywhere. I am not going anywhere. I wouldn't be running if I didn't absolutely believe that I am the best candidate to beat Donald Trump in 2024. We had a Democratic nominating process where the voters spoke clearly. I won 14 million of those votes, et cetera. So I just want, I not only believe that from the beginning, but I wanted to reassert it and demonstrate that it's true. And I'm going to be doing that all through this week and from here on.
Well, that did not stop a barrage of questions about the president's health at the latest White House briefing from Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
Wait a second.
Eight times, or at least once, in regards to the president specifically.
Hold on a second.
Not what you should be able to answer by this point.
Wait, no. No, wait a minute. Ed, please. A little respect here, please. So every year, around the president's physical examination, he sees a neurologist. That's 3 times.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke to Brett Bruen, president of the Global Situation Room, former White House Global Engagement Director under President Obama, and I began by asking him what he made of Joe Biden's defiant message.
Essentially, he's trying to quiet the chorus of critics within the Democratic Party. I don't know that it will be effective because the message of shut up, sit down, and stop whining isn't necessarily going to go over well with congressional leaders who are concerned about their own political prospects. So at this point, while it's an aggressive strategy, it's a new strategy for the Biden campaign, it's one that ultimately may backfire for him.
Yeah, I mean, he's come out fighting, hasn't he? Finally, really directly addressing those growing calls for him to pull out of the presidential race.
And he needed to do it last week. I mean, he spent days holed up in the White House. He didn't even reach out to Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill for several days. So this is a case of too little, too late, or maybe too much, too late. But either way, I don't see a scenario in which the polls turn around, in which the donors decide all of a sudden that what they saw in the debate isn't likely to happen again. And while certainly Biden has presented a very vigorous figure in some of the campaign rallies, even today's call-in to the Morning Joe show on MSNBC seemed to be fairly scripted. I mean, he was shuffling around papers you could audibly hear as he was doing the interview. What we're not seeing, and this is what, Carol, is problematic, is that more extensive exposure. I mean, he did 20 minutes with George Stephanopoulos, 18 this morning on the call-in show. He's got to get out there more if he's going to overcome the doubts. And what we're seeing are sort of these episodic engagements, which I don't think is enough.
He's now laid down this direct challenge to those saying that he should pull out of the race, saying, well, if you don't think I should run, challenge me at the convention. Is anyone actually going to perhaps take up that challenge?
Well, there's some irony to be found in that because Biden was very dismissive of his main Democratic challenger, Congressman Dean Phillips of Minnesota, who asked to debate, who asked to be taken seriously. And Biden and his campaign refused, unfortunately so, because we would have perhaps discovered some of these weaknesses earlier on in the campaign. But sure, Biden is going to throw down the gauntlet and say, anyone who wants to cross me can do so at their own peril. And yet we may, Carol, see that some candidates or a group of delegates comes together and mucks up the process. They don't even have to declare their candidacy to make it very messy in Chicago. And let's not forget, 1968, a very messy Democratic convention in Chicago. I think a lot of us are having flashbacks to that at this point.
It seems to have taken a while to build, but is it your assessment that there is now a real head steam building amongst senior Democrats to try to force Joe Biden, even at this late stage, to pull out?
I think it was notable what we heard yesterday in that call amongst Democratic members of Congress. You had some big names in there. Jerry Nadler, who listeners may know was one of the key Democrats in the impeachment trial of Donald Trump in both instances. Joe Morelli, actually from my hometown of Rochester, New York. I mean, these are folks who chair committees. These are folks who carry weight on Capitol Hill. And it wasn't by accident that information leaked out there. And I think it has caused the president and his campaign to try and do something dramatic at this late hour to try and stem the bleeding, if you will. But I expect we will hear more. I expect we will see more from polls and from donors. And just quite frankly, let's not forget, Carol, next week is the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They're going to be able to dominate the headlines. And, unfortunately, the president is not making it any clearer in terms of what is our strategy for overcoming Trump's rising poll numbers and the momentum he seems to have built up.
Yeah, and Donald Trump is reveling in his rival's problems, isn't he? And every time Joe Biden comes out, as he did in that primetime TV interview on Friday, to try to show that he is actually on top of events, that he's got what it takes, not just to run for the presidency again, but to serve another term, he simply adds to the concerns, because he made that comment that seemed to almost accept that he might lose against Donald Trump.
Well, and you heard from him a lot in each of these instances about what he's done in the past. And nobody, especially those of us in the Democratic Party, debates that he has had a number of notable accomplishments in his first term. The question is, should he be reelected to a second term? And I do think, Carol, that what we are running the risk of here, I should say Biden is running the risk of here, is damaging the legacy of his presidency. He has the opportunity to go out as the president who transitioned the country from the dangers of Donald Trump into the next chapter, into a space of safer waters. And yet, this choice to obstinately hang on to the presidency, to hang on to his campaign for another term in office, despite what is overwhelming evidence. I mean, you look at some of these poll numbers, 70% of Americans don't want him to run, don't think that he should run. Those are not numbers on which you can go up against a formidable candidate like Donald Trump. And this is where I think Democratic leaders need an intervention. They need to come to the White House and say, President Biden, we appreciate everything you've done. We value your experience. We will honor your experience. But it is time to pass the baton. And while I'm not supporting any one of these candidates, I do think some matchup of Vice President Harris along with a governor like Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan would be a very powerful alternative to a Trump presidency, and whomever Trump decides to put on the ballot with him, whether it's Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, are two names that are getting spoken of a lot here in Washington these days.
And of course, we are now on the eve of that big NATO summit there in Washington, and all eyes are going to be on Joe Biden, aren't they?
They are, and that's part of the problem, Carol, because it is a moment of maximum exposure. This is probably my third NATO summit. And what you see at these events is that unguarded interaction and in front of the cameras with other leaders. There are a lot of opportunities here for Biden to literally or figuratively trip up. He will also have on, I believe it's Thursday, his solo press conference. And if he tries, which they have in many of these events in the past, to rush off stage after, 2 or 3 questions, I think it will only add more speculation, more frustration. And if he puts himself out there for a longer period of time, it will open him up to, some misstatements and just further question about, his readiness to carry out the duties of the office of president for the next 4.5 years.
And Joe Biden's age and performance, the questions about that are likely, aren't they, to overshadow a summit that is hugely important, particularly when it comes to trying to get further commitments to support Ukraine. And of course, we've got our new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, making his first big outing on the world stage.
Well, and it was interesting. I was talking to a British reporter this afternoon, and ironically, Keir Starmer may arrive to this NATO summit in a strong, perhaps the strongest position of any leader, because Biden's obviously suffering from a wave of criticism in just the last couple of weeks. You have Emmanuel Macron, who lost pretty convincingly in the polls yesterday in France. Olaf Scholz has his own troubles back in Germany. So here Starmer looks like what passes these days for the new leader of the free world.
Brett Bruen, president of the Global Situation Room, former White House Global Engagement Director under Obama, speaking to me just a little earlier.